Okay, so I had you guys, as Lewis is climbing up the Continental Divide at the farthest reaches of the Missouri River, I wanted you to know that the Americans were not experienced with sort of the enormity, the height of the mountains that you would find, of course, out west. And I've done okay. And so, he climbs up to the Continental Divide. And if you guys ever go onto one of these, you're up in the very kind of pass of the mountain, you're heading over to the other side. I think he was hoping that what would happen is you'd look down upon a river that will take you to the Pacific, and instead, as far as he could see, there was just, snow-capped mountains. He was in the middle of what we call the Bitterroot Range. It's part of the Rocky Mountains. And, that meant that there was going to be quite a difficulty making their way all the way over to where there would be a river. But they made their way down, I think, to the Snake area and then ultimately to the Columbia. They were able to borrow dugout canoes from Native Americans, so they will continue the kind of riverine dynamic as far as the trip is concerned. Finally reaching the Pacific Ocean on November the 5th. Do I have that for you guys? November the 5th, 1805. And I'd just like to describe this moment for you a little bit. And by the way, there's a ton of Lewis and Clark stuff, of course, up when you're in that Washington, Oregon area. Really good museums to go to, of course, and other locations. But I was up there kind of just looking at the final approach to the Pacific Ocean. The Columbia gets really wide right there. In fact, it's more like an estuary than it is actually a river. I think it's probably over 10 miles wide, and there's a causeway. The highway does a causeway, and then it pops up at the very end for more of a bridge so that the traffic on the Columbia can go through there. But in Astoria, Oregon is right in that particular area. But they're coming up and it's foggy. This is November. You guys all know Pacific Northwest is going to be cloudy. It's going to be foggy. And the first thing they noticed was little teeny wavelets hitting the bows of their dugout canoes. And of course, that was the end game of these Pacific rollers that would come in at that time. And they called, when they finally arrived, and they're on the north side of the Washington side of the Columbia, when they finally arrived at the Pacific proper, they called it Cape Disappointment. And they called it Cape Disappointment because they were hoping to meet someone there. There'd been a suggestion of rendezvous. Can you imagine the difficulties of that, though? One group going across overland, another one, a ship coming around on the Pacific side. That doesn't necessarily happen. They do winter there at the mouth of the Columbia River. They decided to camp on the Oregon side, so that's the south side of the Columbia. And they created, their little location was called Fort Clatsop. And one thing that's kind of cool is that they've recreated Fort Clatsop, not exactly where it was located, but near that area. And you go in and you park in the parking lot, and then you walk through the woods to get to it. So you actually feel like you're kind of in that era, in that moment. The fort was built exactly the way it would have looked in terms of Lewis and Clark. It's just a rectangular area, kind of a courtyard in the middle, building on one side, building on the other side, gates, fence to kind of, for protection. The roof slanted in so that they could collect the rainwater if they needed to, of course, for water. And then the men just kind of hunkered down. They were there for, I can't remember what it was, 120 plus days, and they get like 7 days of sunshine. Classic, winter as far as the Pacific Northwest is concerned. But if you go there, we went there it was in the summer, but it was a cloudy day, which I think was appropriate. And I walk inside the fort area, and you can kind of dip then into the actual building structures. And it was dark in there because, of course, they wouldn't have had any illumination. And I could see that they had a little fire right there. And so that was, my eyes are trying to adjust when all of a sudden I see that, on the one side there's a guy dressed like a mountain man. On another guy, there's a guy dressed like a soldier. And of course, I gave a little eek because I didn't expect them to be there. I want you to know they were very kind and understanding of that. And the guy let me wear his coonskin cap, and I felt really nice, Anyway, Fort Clatsop is where they're going to winter. As soon as they could, though, when the season changed, they began to make their way back. So this is up the Columbia River, of course. They had to kind of wait to get through the Rocky Mountains because the snows were there. They had to wait. And then, even then, it was just a slog through these areas. Super difficult, of course. Anyway, they got over the Continental Divide. Lewis and Clark split up the group, and one of them took one route, a little more exploration to kind of see exactly what's going on, meeting up again, and then making their way down the Missouri River. Now, just, I'll tell you this, they're finally going to arrive back home in St. Louis, or back to St. Louis in 1806. The whole trip took 28 months, It will be 8,000 miles of coverage, most of it, of course, done by river. Just this extraordinary kind of expedition that takes place here. Now, just some interesting little things about the Lewis and Clark expedition. It was relatively healthy. I think that's kind of an impressive thing. Only one person died on the Lewis and Clark expedition, and the person who died, I think it was Sergeant Floyd, if I'm not mistaken. He died from a burst of appendix, and you guys all know that's like a congenital situation that would have probably killed him anywhere it would have happened, at least at that particular time. So, kind of intriguing that it was so healthy. They did have some health concerns, and I do want to mention that. The one that I never would have expected that was a major problem for Lewis and Clark were problems of venereal disease. So here's the story. As they would travel through the Native American lands, and they came into contact with the tribe, there were many times where I guess the notion was that these white men might have big medicine. And I guess the way to get some of that medicine was to have sexual intercourse with them. So there seems to be quite a bit of sexual intercourse between the Lewis and Clark expedition and the Native Americans. And it was this interesting thing because it generally was that these women it was like, I'm not going to say they were given, of course, but this was a voluntary situation and it was a consensual situation. And I think the only idea that we have is that maybe there was a notion that there was some big medicine here that could be gained in some particular kind of way. I've never really thought about it, but perhaps were there children who are the result of these unions? Anyway, Lewis complains about this sort of endlessly because the soldiers are getting venereal disease, and of course he's the basic doctor on the expedition. He's got to deal with these particular problems. The one thing that we don't know, and it's not really clear in terms of either one of their journals, were Lewis and Clark partaking themselves of the situation. It's hard to imagine that they probably weren't part of that. But anyway, this was one health problem that, I don't know, I didn't expect to find that when I read about this, and of course, I think it is kind of interesting. One other issue of health that I do want to highlight for you, as Lewis and Clark are coming back down the Missouri River, Lewis and one of the soldiers go hunting. It was one thing they routinely had to do, hunt for fresh game. And the two of them became separated a little bit, and the soldier saw something moving in the bush, and he shot it, and what he shot was Lewis. And he shot him in the butt, and of course, that's better than shooting him someplace else, of course, but, to get butt shot, of course, and it's almost like the funny part of it, get butt shot. But it was a misery as far as Lewis was concerned, and much of the last part of the voyage, he's really hurt, of course. You can imagine, fever and suffering and having to lie on his stomach all the time. But, it is amazing kind of, how relatively healthy the entire expedition was. Okay. Now, ultimately, the critical thing about the Lewis and Clark expedition has to do with, what were they attempting to do, or what were the objectives? So I want to present to you, and these are all really just, put out there by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was the person who wanted certain things to be done. So I'm going to go through the objectives. This becomes essentially the significance of Lewis and Clark, of course, something I'd like you to have some sense of. So here we go with the objectives. And objective number one was economic. And the basic objective here was to find a navigable route across the continent. They had always wanted that Northwest Passage, so there was some hope that there would be some kind of a riverine transportation route that you could make here. That's the reason that they pushed their boats so far up the Missouri to the point of actually kind of pushing them through the shallows. Just how far could you get a boat? How far could you get a craft? And of course, ultimately having to give up on that. And then, of course, on the other side there was the Columbia River, but the problem was in between was an impassable area for any kind of transportation. These guys are going through mountain passes, so Lewis would, of course, unfortunately have to report to Jefferson, this is not a way that we can travel. So that was an objective, of course, but that was one that didn't work out very well. A secondary critical objective was diplomatic. And the diplomatic objective was to meet and greet the Native Americans and to establish a relationship with them, to let them know that there's a kind of a new boss in town, a new chief in town. In one of the intriguing components of this, Thomas Jefferson wrote a speech that he wanted to be read to the Native Americans. So I have this image of, here they're meeting a new tribe or something like that. They ask the warriors to sit down there, and then Lewis stands up and he reads this speech to the Native Americans. And of course, you guys know right there, there's an incongruity. Lewis is speaking in English, and the Native Americans can't understand that. So, and of course, they understood that. So they would have this train of translation, and it would routinely go from, for instance, English to French, French to Hidatsu, and Hidatsu to Lakota, or something like that. Okay, routinely having multiple translations that would have to go before it would actually be communicated to the Native Americans. And I've always wondered, at the very end of that telephone, if you will, it's like the telephone game, here you have a Native American and, he's hearing what's being said. And basically what's being said is that the Americans are proclaiming this is their land and they're going to take over. Do you want to communicate that to the Native Americans? And how many times I wonder would they would just change it to, and they really like you guys and they have a lot of presents for you. And, and get an applause. And of course, here's old Lewis going, oh, they love us, that kind of thing. Now, one thing that did really help here was that Lewis and Clark had a tremendous number of little trinkets and gifts, which they did give the Native Americans to smooth over the situation. But generally speaking, the diplomatic relations between Lewis and Clark and the Indians went very, very well. There's only one kind of significant manifestation of conflict, and that conflict became between Lewis and some Blackfeet. This young Blackfeet warrior tried to steal Lewis's horse, and of course you're wondering where the horse came from. I don't know exactly, but they did use some of the Shoshone horses. But he tried to steal it, and Lewis shot him. So one Blackfoot Indian was killed, and perhaps others. That's all the only one I'm aware of. But it goes relatively well. So they're pretty good diplomatic relations, and the establishment, at least in the eyes of Lewis and Clark, of a relationship with the Native Americans. Another objective was cartographical or mapping. This was primarily William Clark's responsibility. So William Clark will create what was essentially the first continental map of the United States of America. Admittedly, it was a map that only had a thin arrow of a narrow avenue of understanding. But that's exactly what it would do, kind of show the way all the way through the Missouri, Columbia to the Pacific. One little task that Lewis and Clark had was that they had to name things all the time. So here's the main line of the Missouri, and of course they had to decide which is that. And there were times when rivers coming together were almost equal in size. So you have to make your determination. This is the main line, that's the main line, that kind of thing. But they also had to name, of course, every little tributary that's coming in. And so they just go through the gamut of all the names that they're familiar with, and including very important names: the Jefferson River, the Madison River, the Gallatin River, rivers, of course, that would be named after important. And of course themselves, Lewis and Clark and members of the expedition. Probably everybody's going to get their name somewhere. Okay, so they do create this map, and that was an essential part of the objective. Now, in a purely Thomas Jefferson kind of objective, there was a scientific effort to be made here. And what had happened was, Jefferson was just this eclectic individual who was just kind of in love with everything. And if you ever get to go to Monticello, of course, it's both, just the design of the building, which is interesting, but all the collections of Thomas, all this stuff that you go in the main hall, there's just things from all over, basically. He just was interested, it seems like, in everything. And was always interested in all the very intelligent people that were part of America, and would bring them into the White House to wine and dine and talk to them. But Jefferson was very interested in the science, the expansions of scientific understanding that could take place as they traveled to the West. So he made sure that Lewis was trained in classification, scientific classification, and Lewis actually was a fairly fine artist. He not only would identify things, but he would then draw them. So Lewis is credited with the discovery, if you will. Remember what that's kind of Vespuccian notion, right? The understanding and articulation of over 220 plants and over 100 animals. And forgive me for not remembering what they all are. You can look at the list of the animals that are kind of attributed, including cutthroat trout or something like that. But the one I always remember for Lewis is the prairie dog. Lewis was the first European or non-Indian to identify the prairie dog, and he of course, he wanted to sort of understand it, and they thought they could capture one. His idea was to capture one, and then, of course, take it back to Jefferson. And he thought it'd be easy to capture a prairie dog, but it took like the entire Corps all day to just get one. And of course, the animal never survived all the way back to Washington, D.C. This always makes me think of the times when I've tried to kind of roust out a gopher out of my backyard or something like that. It's not the easiest thing to do. This one time I tried to flood out their hole, and I left the hose in there, and I kind of forgot, and we left. And then I came back and I realized I'd left my hose running in the hole, and there was no water in my yard. And I'm going, what's going on? So I checked my neighbor's yard. That pretty much had flooded their backyard. Don't tell them. I've never told them what was happening. But anyway, it was harder than they thought, of course, to try to get one of these prairie dogs. So you have these various objectives, but the one that stands out, the one that is critical, right, is that Lewis and Clark's act was an act of imperialism. So this is the aggrandizement and expansion of the United States of America. So Lewis and Clark were basically to go to this area to plant the American flag and to claim it for the United States of America. Do note, and it is a really important little part of the story, they went far beyond. This is pretty much the boundary of the Louisiana Purchase. So they're going beyond the boundaries of the Louisiana Purchase all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And indeed, in that moment, the United States lays its first claim to lands that are on the Pacific Ocean. I do want you to know that that was a problem in some ways, because there's a competing claim here. The Spanish controlled up to the northern boundary of Alta California, and then George Vancouver had done this in the 1790s. He claimed the entire north coast up here for Great Britain, and of course George Vancouver will leave his name upon the area, Vancouver Island, city of Vancouver. So the British already had a pre-existing claim, and now the Americans institute another claim upon it. So we have conflicting claims in the area, and of course I will tell you a little bit later about how they're going to work out those conflicting claims. But the essential reason for Lewis and Clark was to go to this newly purchased land, to explore, but most importantly to claim, to lay claim to the land and let everyone know this is part of the United States of America. So that's the essential thing. And through, of course, Lewis and Clark, the United States is, it is, of course, pushing the frontier, but also pushing the boundary of America in a very dynamic way, ultimately all the way to the Pacific Ocean. I don't know if you guys know, but there were many more explorers for the federal government. So I just want to mention Zebulon Pike. Pike will do pretty much an exploration of the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains, so the front ranges of the Rocky Mountains. And of course, among his exploration activities, he will lay claim to, or he will, of course, put his name upon one of the peaks that kind of stands out away from the range, and call it Pike's Peak. But Zebulon Pike was one of the aggressive American kind of explorers looking to this area. Stephen Long will later do a sort of general exploration of the Platte and other parts of the Great Plains, so kind of exploring that area. He actually considered that this would not be a good area for settlement, and in many ways he was absolutely correct, although that's not the way it will play itself out. John C. Fremont, part of this newly emerging agency, the U.S. Topographical Corps, will do some ultimate kind of explorations to not just explore the West and venture all the way to California, but also to kind of demarcate the actual the routes, the trails, and he would ultimately become known as the Great Pathfinder, as he designated and wrote about the actual trails that would take you to the West. Okay, so the government did not have just Lewis and Clark; there were others that were doing the same kind of thing, and the government frontier actually will become a critical part, of course, of westward expansion. Now, as Lewis and Clark are coming down the river, and I just love how fast this happens. So they're coming down the Missouri River. They run into a couple of Americans going up. So here Lewis and Clark are kind of opening the door to the West, and before they can even, get home, there's some Americans that are going with them. Now, the two men were heading back up the Missouri River, and what happened was one of the individuals who was part of the Corps of Discovery, a man by the name of John Coulter, asked if he could go with them. And basically the task of Lewis and Clark was done. They're just going back down the river to St. Louis, of course, to do their report and to receive the acclamation of the nation. And it was a big deal when the Lewis and Clark expedition came home. But, there was no need for John Coulter anymore, so Lewis and Clark consented, and John Coulter turned around with these guys, because he'd already been up there, of course, and he heads back up the Missouri River. The three of them get up into this kind of general area up in here, and they then decide, each one of them, to take like a tributary of the Missouri. So one person would take this one and another, to explore those tributaries. The tributary that Coulter will take him all the way over into this particular area. And what he did was he ventured into a realm that was just sort of fantastic in terms of all the critical little, am I getting my weird blinking already? Yeah, damn it. Okay, let me just tell you what he did, and hopefully it'll follow me through. He ventured in an area where there were geysers shooting out the air, there were petrified trees that were standing up, there was a huge, beautiful lake, there was a giant waterfall. He was the first American ever, of course, the first white person to venture into the realm of the Yellowstone. And what he was doing there, I will tell you what, just as soon as I possibly can. Okay, I'll sign it right now.